I know, and welcome Nick for joining us. Shall we just do a brief introduction again of who we are? And just to kick off the discussion, can I ask each of the panelists to give their sort of 20-second, 30-second golden tip to SMEs, and then we'll pick up the questions in the chat bar. So if I kick off, I'm Bill Gillespie, I'm Chief Executive of Wessex AHSN, and my main advice would be for SMEs to think very carefully about where the value of their innovation sits. And that kind of echoes Michael's point. It may sit within a provider, but equally, the main value may be felt across an entire health system. And where that sits involves different approaches. So that would be my piece of advice. Mike, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think know your customer. We are in a incredible opportunity in this country with a healthcare system with lots of data, with a single payer system. Know your customer is easy when you know how to find information to support your option. And as I outlined in my talk, you have to get the 4 in a row. It's like a game of Connect 4. Your technology must benefit patients, must benefit providers, it must benefit payers of care, and ultimately your device has got to be good for your business. So make sure you optimize the price and only price it when you know its value. So that would be my my words of advice. And so thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Jeffrey?
Advice to the companies: it's never too early to start talking to your stakeholders to get their feedback on where your device might fit. It's disappointing the number of devices we see at an advanced stage of development that when you start talking to particularly the clinicians, they go, sorry, this is just not going to impact on our medical practice. So you talk to them early. Make sure you're actually doing something that's good, that people want to be able to use.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Nick?
My advice would be to hone in on what the problem is that you're addressing. What are you bringing to the table? What is that problem? What is the cost of running with the problem? What's your solution to the problem? How does it work? What does it do? What's it going to cost?
Thanks, Nick. Kim?
Thank you. Yes, I think my advice would be to have a really good look at the way that care is delivered within the NHS at the moment. So your technology that you're intending to replace, do go out and speak to clinicians and make sure that you have the full picture of exactly what is currently going on, because it may be different in different centres, or it may be different than what is recommended in the guidelines.
Thank you, Kim. Daniel?
Yeah, so I'd echo a lot of what's been said, to be honest. And I think a sort of common theme there is it's around evidence. So evidence for cost savings, evidence for effectiveness and cost effectiveness. And I think what we're hearing is there's too many products coming through that don't really have that strong evidence base and haven't sort of done the groundwork to establish that. So look at what NICE are asking for, look at what comparable products are able to provide, look at what the sector's asking for, and really sort of work to develop that strong evidence base would be my advice.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Shall we just start to pick up some of the questions in the sidebar? First one I'm looking at, I know from Julian, during COVID recovery, how likely is it that the blended payment system will ever be applied to elective care, bearing in mind the resistance to it from providers, commissioners, etc. And Mike, you mentioned, I think, the huge backlog in elective care as a result of COVID. Shall I have an initial stab at that and then bring in some members of the panel? So I think and I think I said it in the presentation, the intention is not pure blended payment that says let's look at costs, but looking at, are there areas where it's appropriate to have a blend between a new style of paying that also may have incentives in place in some places. So I think things like does this shift care from inpatient to day case? Does it shift it from day case to an outpatient setting? Those sorts of things are likely to continue to be incentivized. But looking more broadly than that, I think there are areas where systems may be interested in different sorts of service models. So, for example, we know from NICE guidance that there are many people with arthritis where the further deterioration of their condition can be prevented through sustained exercise, loss of weight, etc. And that has been given little attention in health and care systems. So you could see blended payments coming in that identify that population group and say to innovators, how can you help us target that group? So that's an incentive outside of a hospital setting. So that would be my initial go at that. Did any of our, Mike, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, what you were saying on your presentation earlier, Bill, you know, paying by results is like a currency. It's the currency that the NHS has to pay for activity, and it's now the opportunity, because of this new arrangement for the first half of this, is that hospitals have got a budget they can spend how they like, and they have to deal with the local population. But there's much more flexibility in the system now for hospitals to choose new care pathways. And I think the thing about it is, though, if you're going to start to try and get into that, you have to understand, firstly, the existing arrangements, but also you have to go in with a clear-cut value proposition. And you can only do that when you know what the hospital's challenges are around that particular area of surgery. So opportunities there, it's certainly for the next 6 months, which is H1, part of this scheme, where again, much more flexibility away from paying by results, and the future of it will be for more flexibility in the system. So that's really good news for MedTech if you can get in and you understand your value prop and you've got the evidence to support that, and you've got the economics understanding of the account and what you're going to do to help them, then it's a great thing that they've put in place.
Thanks, Mike. Does anyone else want to come in on that one, or shall we move on? There is a question, Kim, this one might be for you on the Q&A bar. It was mentioned that NICE MTAC, if you wouldn't mind decoding the acronyms for us.
Yes,
NICE,
of course.
Do you want to pick that question up that's really addressed to NICE?
Yes, sure. So currently what happens is medical technologies, medical devices are go through the Medical Technologies Advisory Committee, so that's MTAC, for cost-saving guidance. And the only route to look at cost-incurring technologies, so cost-effectiveness analysis, is to go through the technology appraisal programme, which is obviously very full up with drugs and pharmaceuticals most of the time. So there haven't been many technologies, many medical devices that have been evaluated that way. So this is a new proposal in our revised methods that the Medical Technologies Advisory Committee will be looking at cost-incurring medical recommendations on them based on cost effectiveness. So just like we do for drugs, and it will be a very similar method, actually, similar method and similar process that we go through that, looking at the thresholds of cost effectiveness. And it will actually come with a funding mandate, as the drugs are currently funded as well and mandated.
Thanks, Kim. Nick, there's a couple of questions in the bar about that are really, I think, procurement and might be for you. So our products will be prescribed through drug tariff. Would you suggest we still look to NHS supply chain tenders, even though we're a micro SME?
Go on, he's going to finish, or?
No, yeah, I think the second question is a similar one, just about supply chain tenders, micro SME, and unsure we'll be able to compete.
Well, I would recommend to any SME that if they believe that they can win some business from the NHS, to go for it and keep your eye out on Contracts Finder. All procurement projects or procurement exercises over 20k have got to be advertised on there, and that goes across the board of all the public sector. So yeah, definitely look out for them. And I would also, talk to your local hospitals. Try and get a champion if it's a medical device. Try and get a champion within the area where that device is used, and also to talk to procurement. There is a SIP challenge that's put out every year, 4 billion a year, cost improvement program. Talk to someone. What's the correct protocols to do to approach you in relation to the products we sell? What are those products? They are such and such devices for such and such, and just push gently, cajole, persuade, and get your way in. I've sold to the NHS procurement software for about 10 years. I got it in 60 hospitals by doing just that.
I'm going to pick one up that is probably quite difficult, but isn't it? What is the typical cost of adoption for innovative devices? It's how long is a piece of string? But maybe Mike or Jeffrey, have you kind of got from your experience a kind of range of some of the costs around maybe in your case, Jeffrey, the development phase, and Mike, your perspective on adoption?
I'll just start with that. I don't have any specific ones because we've not actually done any full-scale analysis of this, but our clinical director, Tom Clutton-Brock, does come up with the figures of, it can be 10 to 15 years from initial idea to actually get a medical device product onto the market. And you're possibly talking into the multiple millions for some of those devices. Hopefully the more straightforward devices are not going to cost that, but it does take, unfortunately, a long time because of the time it takes to actually get people involved to then help you gather all the evidence that you need to actually show. I mean, it's the stages. You first got to show that your device actually addresses the problem. You've got to get the engagement from the stakeholders to actually work with you to look at that problem. You start gathering the evidence to then go for the more detailed studies to actually then look at clinical and then cost effectiveness. And then you actually go through the process of health economic assessment with NICE to get it adopted. And obviously, simpler devices, you might not need all of that evidence, but unfortunately, it does take a long time. Yeah. And partly because the clinical college you're working with have got their clinical work to focus on, they're doing any clinical trials to actually gather evidence as a sideline, if you like.
Yeah. Mike, did you? Yeah. Thanks, Jeffrey.
No, we work predominantly with North American companies, and that's partly because there's an understanding that you can't just turn up in a hospital on a Monday morning with a product and say, will you buy it? So they know that there's this thing called reimbursement. So we work most North American companies, and I was quoted in America, it costs 4.6 years and $30 million to get a product to market. So that's a lot of money. One of the things that companies do all wrong is they design products, they talk to clinicians, and clinicians tell them what studies to run. Clinicians are not health technology assessors. They don't necessarily understand what evidence, particularly economic evidence, is required for HTAs like NICE and others in the world. So one of the ways that companies burn and waste money and time in this stage is by doing the right study, not getting the right evidence. And as mentioned earlier, we offer a service through NICE called MetaTool, and we help companies to understand, very early on, what's the sort of level of evidence you're going to need, what's your gaps in your plans. We can do protocol review services and give you an understanding for looking at your protocols, will that meet the criteria of HTAs across the world? So that's one of the most expensive parts of the development, is getting that evidence, as Jeff outlined as well. We do have an amazing infrastructure in this country with the NIHR and National Office of Clinical Research Infrastructure and others that can help. There's funding available for studies and research as well with the NIHR. So there's ways that this can be funded as well. So there's my view on costs.
And just to give people some hope, so this isn't MedTech, but we supported a company, S12 Solutions. So it's a digital platform that supports doctors and allied mental health professionals who operate under Section 12 of the Mental Health Act. The value proposition was conceived by an approved mental health professional back in 2017. And she just sold her company to a Canadian company for £4.5 million in April, with a view to that being part of the global offer of the company. So that's not MedTech, it's a different kind of area, but it can happen. There's a question in the sidebar round from Andrew Cowan, which, Daniel, maybe for you to pick up. If you see at the top there, Future Care keen to get support for bespoke non-invasive wearable medical precision instrument for infants. It remotely monitors infants' vital signs in the home, hospital, anywhere. And currently, his comment is unable to get NHSX help. So maybe that's a sort of, throw open to the panel, but there's the reference to NHSX. So Daniel, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to offer a view on that. So very broadly, the work we're doing in NHSX, at least in my team, is looking at the sort of overall pathway and the sort of systems we put in place to enable innovations to reach patients on a systematic basis rather than sort of picking innovations on a case-by-case basis and promoting those. With that said, there is a team looking at remote monitoring, has done a lot of great work through COVID with the sort of NHS at home piece. So I'm very happy to put you in touch with that team. I know that they have supported some innovators on a sort of more bespoke basis. So I don't know what the best route is to get in touch with us after the session, but I'm very happy to pick.
I'm sure we'll sort that one out for Andrew. Daniel, whilst you've got the mic, so in digital, one of the issues is sort of minimum viable product, and you kind of get caught with, sometimes we work with people who kind of, well, if the NHS had been adopting iPhones way back and whenever they came out, we would have waited until it was iPhone version 29, because there's a tendency to want. Do you want to say a bit about, is that where your contingent sort of reimbursement stuff comes in?
Yeah, I mean, I would caveat all this by saying we're at quite an early stage. We're thinking through a lot of this stuff. I do recognise that's a problem. The processes we have in place are largely configured towards pharmaceuticals that have a very long development cycle, and then generally when they're done. Whereas sort of with tech products, you're looking at a much faster and iterative development cycle, and our sort of regulatory processes and sort of reimbursement mechanisms aren't necessarily aligned to that. And I don't want to sort of step on NICE territory as well, but I'm sure that is something that NICE and MHRA have sort of on their radar. But broadly speaking, what we're trying to do is understand what do we need to tweak and change with the current processes to better support that sort of innovative and faster tech cycle, while making sure that, we do need to protect the taxpayer from funding sort of unduly risky products or, products that don't then pay off. I think some failure and some sort of, in inverted commas, wasted funding is okay to support innovation, but we do need to recognise that there's sort of limits to how much we could really support that. So it's about striking that balance, isn't it, between like what's the right level of evidence, but also making sure that the NHS isn't too difficult to access for products that are still in that formative stage. And we are working with ABHI on that contingent reimbursement approach, as you say, to try and understand both what the sort of NHS role is on that, but also what the industry role is, sort of meeting halfway on that. I would describe that.
Thanks, Daniel. Question from Jeffrey. Talking to stakeholders, what happens when the stakeholders are strongly resistant to change because we're addressing productivity where the status quo is kind of, well, it's impossible. So people are stuck in the present as opposed to seeing the opportunities of the future. I'm sure some of our panelists are kind of familiar with that. Anyone want to comment on that one?
I think that's directed to me first, so maybe if I say something first. I was just trying to think how to reply to Kevin in a short message and not getting very far. I think the problem with that, the problem you've got there is we've not directly experienced this ourselves, but I can understand the frustration. But it's possibly even more important to get engaged with the stakeholders, because they're going to be the ones who can tell you where the resistance is coming from. and then you've got to try and frame how your innovation is going to help overcome whatever the resistance is, to then, why is it going to help them in their productivity? Where's it going to be beneficial to them? And that's got to be the key point of how you put your technology forward. It's always got to be for the benefit of the clinicians or the service team or the patients. I hope that's a helpful comment.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Mike, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Just on Daniel, thank you for what you're saying about digital. I think the whole digital industry needs to understand that the opportunity for digital is out there. The issue is reimbursement, because if digital was a drug and you could swallow it, then it would be prescribable. But a lot of these things that happen outside of hospitals and aren't covered by the hospital's payment structures are extremely difficult to get funding for. And it's really heartening to hear that there are plans. I mean, right now, in all honesty, if people come to me with digital, I recommend they go to Germany, because Germany does have a very clear-cut system for the reimbursement of digital products that fall outside of hospitals. Coming back to the thing that you were talking about, Jeff, about hospital status quo, not really appreciating. I mean, going back to what I was saying earlier, I mean, we sit on not only 1.3 billion NHS patient care records to understand the past, we also have the waiting list data for the future. And we know by speciality, by hospital, how big those waiting lists are. So hospitals are interested in this big thing. It's called operational gain. It's how are they going to do more to achieve their targets of getting through the 5 million patients who are on the waiting list, and for it to be a good good experience for the patient and for the hospital's business. So there is enough information out there to understand what the opportunity is and how to approach. And as I said earlier, it's about knowing your customer, knowing what those challenges are for the hospital, reading trust reports, understanding where those pressure points are, and trying to come in with a solution that will work. And that's how you overcome barriers. That's what I did with venous closure. I freed up 55,000 bed days a year for the NHS. We did varicose vein surgery into outpatients, making it good for the hospital's business, but good for the NHS, because it can be done. So it's about understanding the customer is my advice.
And if I could come in from my experience, the innovation appetite within the clinical community, within organizations, within systems can vary. Talk to some of the people on this panel, talk to your AHSN, because they're likely to have a sense of where those with an innovation appetite are within a system. The other thing I'd say is frame your value proposition potentially, not just in terms of the present, but in the future. So, for example, if you've got something that is highly disruptive in nephrology, is quite threatening if it says, well, you'd need 8 fewer nephrologists. But if you take Mike's point about project forward on what current demands are if they carry on, and the answer is you need to employ another 60 nephrologists, then people know that isn't going to happen. It's just not possible. And it's much easier to have a conversation about the value proposition. We've got, I'm just looking at whether we've picked up all the questions. Kim, did you, anything else on the NICE perspective you wanted to come in? But I guess this issue of this transition from looking at both trust, but looking at systems, is NICE doing any thinking about what that means in terms of how it approaches things?
Well, I mean, I think at the moment we are trying to join up our programs a bit better so that the clinical guidelines and the recommendations on individual technologies are more aligned and are kind of updated and developed as an ongoing constant process known as living guidelines. But that's something that's very much in the works at the moment, so that may cover that aspect of things. There was one question I wanted to answer in the Q&A, which was about the single gateway, which is called Health Tech Connect, and there was a link, I think, on my presentation where you can find that portal.
Okay, thanks for that, Kim. we've probably got time just to pick up. I think the final question I can see that we haven't picked up. So someone in the room has had a one-to-one with the NHS tariff team director. Doesn't bode well for transition from secondary to primary care funding device in the community. Would panel like to comment? Yeah, we are the lead AHSN on the rollout of Pheno across the country, which is a diagnostic around asthma, with use in the intention being it's used in primary care. I think it is a challenge. How do you find the right resourcing model for tech that will be operated in primary care, and where some of the main value actually is in reduction in non-elective activities, say, into acute. And I think that is a serious area where it will be a test, not just of the development of payment policy, but a test of the development of integrated care systems. The ones that can crack that will show some, demonstrate some real maturity. Anyone else wanted to comment on that one?
Absolutely. I mean, going back to what you were saying about the Pheno, that was a product we took through NICE for a client about 8 years ago, and we could see the challenges because GP practices are businesses, right? They are little businesses as well. What has to happen, and we're working with clients at the moment in this exact space, the impact of solving something in primary care, which reduces activity in secondary care. We're doing a lot of work around epilepsy, for example, as well as asthma, to look at where patients are frequent flyers into the system, costing the commissioner money. And that's where you use the relationship with the hospital, with giving them the conversation with the commissioner to show that, look, if we solve this problem in primary care, it will reduce the frequency of unelected patients in secondary care. So it's possible. You need the data to be able to have those conversations. And of course, the great role of NICE is once products have gone through NICE and you have that badge of recommendation through guidance, then hospitals are obliged to, under their contract, to apply to comply with NICE or have regard to NICE guidance. So there are ways. It's encouraging that we have these ICSs, because I see that this continuation of care into primary care can be covered. So I'm optimistic for the future. I'm great to hear what Daniel and the team at NHSX are doing, and that all bodes well for the future.
And if I briefly just add to that, I think what you might have touched on direct enhanced services contracts for primary care networks in my presentation, that debate kind of got pretty challenging, where the GPC, the negotiating committee for GPs, pushed back on the specifics of direct enhanced services, a year, 18 months ago. But you could see in future years, and those enhanced services are negotiated at a national level. You could start to see a negotiation with the GPC at a national level about PCNs, so groups of GPs working at a population of 60,000 or so, that starts to put incentives in place for adoption of technologies that are both good for patients out of hospital but have an impact on hospital care.
I think if I could just very briefly add to that, Bill, I think that's exactly what is happening, and we're having some conversations at national level around putting in place incentives for cardiovascular remote monitoring, including with digital tech, for example. So I think realistically, to sort of drive change in primary care, often it does require a financial incentive. Often that does need to be driven at national level, and we're sort of aware of that. That's just sort of how the system's set up, isn't it?
That's great. Well, that's a kind of optimistic note to end on, because I think what we might be saying is the system may not be as joined up as you might want it to be as MedTech, but actually there are signs that it is getting a lot more joined up than it previously has been. So I'm conscious of time. It's bang on 3 o'clock. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone for your questions. And if you're going on to the expo session, good networking. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.